You're listening to Messianic Insight, the live podcast from Kehilat Etz Chaim, Tree of Life Congregation in Toronto, with Messianic Rabbi Ben Wolman.
We're going back to the future this week because the actual Jerusalem Day, or the actual day on which Israel celebrated Jerusalem Day, was May 21st on our calendar. And as you know, the Jewish calendar is, somewhat out of sync sometimes with our seasons. And this really is around the time when, on our calendar, the Six-Day War was fought. And we are talking about Jerusalem in the context, really, of the many things which took place over the long history. So settle back, because I'm going to talk at length today, and I'm going to give us a wide perspective on the story of Jerusalem, and particularly beginning with this prophecy, which for 2,000 years was largely dismissed, removed from the heart and mind of the wider body of Messiah. The Christian churches really largely did not pay a great deal of attention to this promise in Luke 21, where Yeshua said Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Or as we read in this CJB, Yerushalayim be trampled down by the Goyim, which really means the nations. And this is the challenge for us. We are trying to discern the age in which we are. And never has that been more significant than it is now. People are saying, what times are we living in? And change in what has happened with Jerusalem is one of the keys to understanding where we are right now and our situation. And the rise of modern Jerusalem is the story of a city that has emerged slowly into the city envisioned by Yeshua, a city restored to Israel. By the late 19th century, really, it was only the Jewish people who were fully focused on the spiritual legacy of Israel. The church had largely set it aside. As for Islam had some interest in Jerusalem, but it had almost long faded. And much of the real interest and concern about Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Jewish people alone. It was the Jewish people who were coming back to Jerusalem, because it is only the Jewish people whose daily prayers are for the restoration of that city. Indeed, every year their prayers are indeed for the return. Next year in Jerusalem is the watchword of Israel. This alone is the key to understanding modern Israel. And the restoration of Jerusalem has really come because the heart of Israel has been entwined with the concern of the future of Zion like no other people. And the interest in Jerusalem that has followed ever since is really simply the result of what Israel has done, and the world stepping in and saying, oh yes, but it's our Jerusalem too. But the truth is, Jerusalem is what it is only because the modern state of Israel, which is a challenge to the nations, has risen up. And we need to understand that one of the realities is that as Jerusalem has emerged stronger over time, it has grown in its Jewish identity. By the 1880s, the late 19th century, Jerusalem was really a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. The majority of the city was Jewish residents, and this was still a very compacted city. It was not very much outside the city walls. In fact, outside the city walls was not particularly considered a safe area. And a lot of the country was highly undeveloped. There are so many false reports concerning this. But we know from many people who went throughout the land during that time, the country was largely unoccupied. And the reason is because this area had many, many absentee landlords. It wasn't empty, but it was not occupied as some insist it was. The other thing, too, is that it would remain under a strong Turkish hold. We know that when Theodore Herzl went to speak to the Turkish Sultan, he had some interest in what Herzl had to say, but the Turks had no interest whatsoever in ever giving up Jerusalem. The key to the change that took place in the circumstance was the incredible investment by the British Empire in what they called the Egyptian exploratory force, or their investment into the Middle East during the First World War. Part of that was the remarkable number of troops which the British brought into the Middle East. The force which the British brought in is remarkable for its diversity. There were Scots, Irish, Gurkhas. There was a division of troops from Hong Kong, but also a significant number of the troops that went to Israel were from Australia and New Zealand. And it was the Australians and New Zealanders who had suffered stinging defeats at Gallipoli and Gaza, who were faced on October 31st, 1917, with a looming defeat when they brought to bear one of the last great cavalry charges of modern warfare that turned the tide in the Middle East. It seemed during that day when they were fighting in Beersheba that they were about to lose the battle. And the Australians attacked across the plain with just a half hour of daylight left to fight. And it was they who saved the day. After Beersheba, the Brits grew very confident that Jerusalem would fall. And Lloyd George, the prime minister, had asked General Allenby, "Give me Jerusalem by Christmas." And they were confident that this was going to happen. In that light was when they issued the Balfour Declaration. This declaration in which they declared their support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It is one of the most remarkable documents of the 20th century. And I assure you that one of the fascinating aspects about it is that it is such controversy that there are nations today that are still working to reverse the Balfour Declaration. And yet the reality is, of course, that the declaration cannot be reversed. The effects of it cannot be reversed. The British and their masses of troops came up against Jerusalem in the very bitter November and December of 1917. It was extremely difficult going. The rains were heavy, nasty, and cold. Many of the troops originally had been moving through the sweltering heat of the desert, and they were not prepared for the change in climate. They fought in very, very bitter weather. Those of you who are familiar in a small way with Jerusalem know what those Judean hills are like. You've often passed by them as you go through those highways around the city. The hills around the city are uneven, broken. This was extremely difficult terrain in which the British and the troops, which they had brought from around the world, had to sustain battle while the Turks put up a tremendous fight. However, by December 8th, the Turks had abandoned Jerusalem, having sworn never to surrender the Holy Land. General Allenby entered the city on December 11th, 1917. It is one of the most remarkable events, as I said, in modern history, because it completely transformed the Middle East. The League of Nations, within a few years, affirmed the creation of a British mandate, which you see in front of you. The mandate originally included an area that was supposed to all be for a Jewish homeland. But the British quickly reversed themselves, and they instead gave 77% of the mandate to a country which they called Transjordan. They hoped that by doing this, they would satisfy the Arab nations that they were creating a similar place for the Arab nations or the Arab peoples who might be displaced by the creation of a Jewish state. They were wrong. In fact, all that happened was a country that eventually became known as Jordan was created, and the Arab populace in Jewish Palestine simply hunkered down and became more and more resistant to the British mandate. Despite everything that was going to happen, the visionary individual, David Ben-Gurion, who had become Israel's first prime minister, who, by the way, you may have heard that he was a man of a secular bent. Don't believe it. David Ben-Gurion was a man who was fascinated all his life by the biblical, inspirational vision. And he was a tremendously astute scholar of the Bible. And despite all the challenges posed by the capital, which was in a very awkward place for the Jewish settlements, he insisted from the beginning that the state of Israel has had and will have only one capital, the eternal Jerusalem. And it was in that vision that the nation continued with that vision until today. In 1947, after the Second World War, despite the horrors of the Holocaust, one of the most remarkable events in the post-war period was the UN's decision to fulfill the promise that they had originally made in 1922. Now, it was a bitterly fought decision and extremely, extremely controversial. The creation of the nation of Palestine. And by the way, there are those who somehow think that Israel existed only because other nations allowed it to exist. But the truth is, as soon as they began to bring in this they began to allow this to take place, virtually every aspect of their situation was fraught with danger. The British, who had been running the mandate since the First World War, really did not support the establishment of a Jewish state. They did not assist in any way any transitional government to happen. In fact, many British officers joined with the Arabs and other Arab governments and other Arab armies to prepare to fight the Jews. who were essentially stretched out, as you can see from this map, that the Jewish state was a zigzag of areas within the Palestinian areas. And by the way, one of the complaints of the time was that the Jews received far too much land. But you might notice that area in the south, that is largely desert. That was largely Negev desert, totally unusable land. So the complaints and the demands that were being placed against them were extremely painfully unfair. Jerusalem was originally slated to be a city under international UN administration, but this partition plan was rejected by the Arabs from the very moment that the UN agreed to it. Furthermore, as soon as it happened, there was widespread violence. Ben Yehuda Street here is shown in February 1948 during a bombing. There was tremendous violence over the issue of the partition. And of course, that violence extended to many of the states in which Jewish people lived throughout the Middle East, in areas from Syria all the way to Morocco. There were terrible riots, and the Jewish populace in many of the North African countries where they had lived for thousands of years suddenly were thrust out of their nations. Approximately 700,000 to 800,000 Jewish people were displaced because of the Arab nations' intransigence and refusal to accept the state of Israel from the beginning. Furthermore, it became a greater challenge at the very moment when they created the state. On May 13th, the day before the state was declared, the settlements south of Jerusalem, particularly Kfar Etzion, fell to the Arab Legion. Those are the troops of the kingdom that at the time was called Transjordan, is today called Jordan. Those troops, led by British officers, were some of the most highly trained troops in the Middle East. They massacred the remnants and their prisoners from Kfar Etzion. The last message, the last radio message, declared a desperate Masada battle is waging. And the people in Jerusalem, all those years ago, hearing the radio reports, wondered what would take place with them. This is the furnace, this is the situation in which modern Jerusalem is born, out of conflict and out of the resistance of the nations. And there was no one who's coming to help them. In Tel Aviv, May 14th, 1948, it was a bold decision to create a state in those circumstances, knowing they would immediately go to war. As Isaiah said, whoever heard of such a thing has ever such a thing that is a country born in one day, is a nation brought forth all at once. This was the nation that the Lord restored and brought together. This is Jerusalem as we know it today, but this was not the Jerusalem, of course, of 1948. It was a much smaller city. And we read the words of Pauline Rose, who was a Jewish believer living in Jerusalem during the days of the War of Independence. She gives her remarkable story in her book, The Siege of Jerusalem, which I urge you to consider getting a copy of it. It's a remarkable testament of a believer's faithfulness during very dark times. This is how she describes the actual siege of Jerusalem. The bombardment of shells and mortar bombs goes on day and night. The remarkable thing is that although we have so many sleepless nights, so little food, the people carry on calmly and with such strength. I feel indeed that God's protecting spirit is at work, and each day the onslaught comes with greater fury and rations get smaller. The Jewish people are feeling, though, more and more that God is with them. The Bible is read and quoted in every place, in places where previously it was ignored or even ridiculed, and a new light is beginning to burn, however small it may be, in the terrible darkness of these days. Pauline Rose was a witness to what God was doing. But this was a siege. The tremendous challenge for the new state of Israel was the way in which Jerusalem was so strongly isolated from the stronger Jewish settlements, and particularly from the settlements along the coast near Tel Aviv. The crossroads of all the major roads leading to Jerusalem had to pass underneath this major fort, which was originally a police station created by the British. It was the fort of Latrun. It was held by the Arab Legion. They had wrested it away from the Israeli troops early in the war, led by ex-British officers. And it was a formidable obstacle, and it resisted repeated attacks. Ben-Gurion kept insisting they have to attack, that we must take this fort. We must relieve the siege on Jerusalem. Jerusalem was unable to have new stores of water, let alone food, let alone armaments to fight the continual bombardment that was taking place. The synagogue, which was a major landmark of the city, the Hurva synagogue was, with a creation, was attacked and burned by the Arab Legion on May 26th. They captured it, placed their flag over it one day, and the next day they burned it to the ground, or they burnt it to the extent that they possibly could. I've put into your screen what the modern Hurva synagogue looks like, a replication of the original. What you are seeing in black and white is the charred remains of the synagogue as it was left by the Arab Legion. And the darkest day of the war, May 28, 1948, when the Jewish quarter surrendered, they had fought to the last bullet, but they had nothing else. Rabbi Mordecai Weingarten, who was the rabbi of the synagogue, negotiated negotiated the surrender of the Jewish quarter, but they had been isolated, they had been worn down, and after they surrendered it, the women and children were allowed to leave. The men were taken as prisoners. They would not be freed for many months. And then the Jordanians burned the Jewish quarter largely to the ground. The days were very dark. May 28th, more than a week had passed, and neither supplies or water were able to reach the city. And on that night, Commander Shlomo Shamir, one of the most remarkable commanders in the Israeli forces, decided to seek out an alternative route to the city. Shamir is a remarkable figure. He was actually invited after the War of Independence to become a commander-in-chief of the Israeli forces. He demurred. He stood away and did not take up that position. Instead, he became commander first of the Navy, and years later, not too many years later, commander of the Air Force. He's one of the most actually remarkable figures in the early Israeli army, though not well known to us. And yet, he sets out to find an alternate route. The same night, 10 kilometers away, Eliyahu Selah, who's a Palmach officer, not well known, and really a much more minor figure, but a very determined and well-known leader in his own day of the Palmach. He sets out for the same reason. Morale had been low among Selah's troops, They had been based near Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter had fallen. He feared the city would surrender, and he also decided they needed an alternate route. One comes from the east, one comes from the west. They meet here. I've placed the area roughly on your map. I don't have the exact location, but it was near this area, the kibbutz Harel, which is really, even in modern days, it's about a 10-minute drive away from Latrun. Somewhere in the southwest, they meet. They find an alternate path, and the result is Jerusalem is saved. A new road is built, brilliantly overseen by the friend of Shamir. The American Jewish general, Mickey Cohen, oversees the rebuilding of a road in 8 weeks, which saves Jerusalem and transforms the future of the city. The final truce takes place in November, and you can see what happens when the Arab Legion and the Israeli troops. The Arab Legion is led by Abdullah Al-Tal, and the Israelis, Moshe Dayan of the IDF, agreed to the ceasefire. Israel, as you can see, is somewhat transformed. It is a country that is a lot more contiguous, as you see, and it insists on having Jerusalem as its capital. And you notice where Jerusalem is. It's kind of in the heart of the country, but in 1948, it's still very isolated, and it is surrounded by enemy territory. Nevertheless, as Ben-Gurion had insisted, Israel only has one capital. On February 14, 1949, the Knesset met in Jerusalem and elected Chaim Weizmann as their president. The post-1948 trail of destruction, sadly, is one of the most difficult stories of the era after the War of Independence. Jewish graves on the sacred slopes of Mount of Olives, where there was a very, very sacred Jewish cemetery. The graves are desecrated. Gravestones are used for paving roads by the Jordanians, and the property of the Jewish quarter is erased, along with 58 synagogues and yeshivas. And despite promises to respect religious sites, Jordan refuses to give Jewish people access to the Kotel. They refuse to let Israelis, whether they're Arabs or Jews, to go to the most sacred site for Israel. For Jewish people, taking away the access to the Western Wall is a heartbreak that for 20 years haunts the Jewish people. I've shown you here what Jerusalem looked like as a divided city. You can see the old city is totally separated from us. I've also noted for you, however, in yellow, these are major areas created. These are major significant sites which Israel builds over the next 20 years. And you notice why they're placed where they are. For safety and security reasons, they are separated from the original Jordanian-controlled areas of the city. And it is a divided city. And it's a painful division. There's a whole areas that we know now today is, part of the beautiful vistas around the old city were filled with barbed wire to separate the city. Nevertheless, Mayor Teddy Kollek rejuvenates Jerusalem. He makes it a city of gardens, parks, great public buildings. This is the original Israeli Museum, which opened in May 1965. Here you see the Hebrew University, which opened its Givat Ram campus in 1948. And of course, the Knesset building, which we're all familiar with, which opened in July 1966. And Pauline Rose, that figure that we remember from the War of Independence, she found a deserted house on a military road right next to the border. And although it was right literally facing armed Jordanian soldiers. She and her husband, who are famous gardeners, decide to make it a place with a garden, and they move into that house. This is the garden she created. It was considered one of the most remarkable gardens in the Middle East. May 1967, Kalak seeks out artists to write songs for Jerusalem. And Naomi Shemer had already written a famous song about Tel Aviv. And she was the one who wrote the song, Jerusalem of Gold. And she got the remarkable singer, Shuli Natan, a woman of remarkable voice, to sing it and make it what was an incredible high note for the restoration of Israel after the War of Independence. But of course, events will move forward in ways that are totally unexpected. You need to fully comprehend that really the Middle East should not have gone to war in 1967. In fact, nobody who was embroiled in the war really thought that there would be one. The Egyptians in 1967 were already overextended in their military in another country, in Yemen. The Syrians, they also were embroiled in too many problems to possibly consider being at war. However, it appears that there were other international forces at work. And as a result, the area became embroiled in a conflict that neither the Israelis nor the other nations around them really comprehended was going to actually boil over into a fight. But the Egyptians were goaded first to drive their troops into Sinai, then to force the UN peacekeeping troops to leave, and then lastly, to block off the Straits of Tiran, which kept goods from flowing into Israel through the important southern port of Eilat. Israel was being dared. Would you really want to force a war? Well, the Israeli public would not stand for this. In many ways, it was the nation itself that declared, we will not stand under threat of destruction. The new Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, told the cabinet on June the 4th that it would be his decision as to when the war would begin. But he also said originally he would not plan to enter the old city of Jerusalem. He said, we can't enter the city of Jerusalem because there will be house-to-house fighting. The danger for troops is far too great. There'll be too many casualties. Also, they warned the Jordanians not to attack. They warned them. They were too ready already. They were too ready for a battle. The Jordanians should not enter the war. However, the cabinet was rather surprised when they woke up the next morning and found out that Moshe Dayan had started the war immediately. So was King Hussein. He got on the phone. He was talking to Nasser. Nasser said to him, we are already winning the war. Jump in now. Get into the war now while you can still make great strides against the Israelis who are already falling back. The war is virtually won. You must join the war now. Nasser, of course, was not telling the truth, and Hussein immediately allowed his troops to begin firing on Jerusalem. His troops, by the way, were led by an Egyptian general who was not fully aware of all that he was facing in Jordan. But as the war began, Jordan began shelling Jewish Jerusalem, and it was at first quite awful. 94 Israelis died, 1,000 were injured. hundreds of buildings were damaged, including the Hadassah Hospital, but the Israelis immediately began to strike back. As the Israelis sweep forward and immediately sweep literally right through the Sinai, Menachem Begin gets on the phone to Dayan and he says to him, the world is not going to let us keep this up. We are going to be stopped. The world is going to stop this war. And the time for you to do the most important thing is now, and that is to enter the old city of Jerusalem. By the way, when Menachem Begin was calling Dayan, he was calling him virtually from underneath his desk because the shelling of Jerusalem was still going on. And he convinces Dayan, literally at that moment, okay, we'll do it. He has troops, paratroopers, some of his most experienced, determined, and some of his best troops are the paratroopers who have not been able to see service in the Sinai, for which they were fully prepared. Instead, they send them into Jerusalem, and the paratroopers are the ones who turn the tide. They are the ones who take the Battle of Jerusalem in the fiercest way against the Jordanians, who are strongly dug in around the city. The Jordanians have been preparing for an Israeli battle for 20 years. They are firmly dug in. The paratroopers are some of the toughest fighters that Israel has. They are extremely experienced. In some cases, they are as determined as any in the Israeli forces. They are the ones who take the battle forward, particularly the battle which is at the top of your screen, Ammunition Hill. This is the battle that wages through Tuesday night. It is the area where the Jordanians are most strongly dug in. And the reason that you need to understand they are strongly dug in is because these are heights that oversee the entire city. From this area, they can fight and they can fire literally on virtually any area that is south of them. They are tough, they are determined, but the paratroopers break through after a night of the worst, most difficult fighting imaginable. They do so at great sacrifice. But by the next morning, having fought their way through, they are prepared for the next stage, which is the entrance into the old city. At 8:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the commander Motagur issues the order, and the troops go in. They blast their way through the Lion Gate, and they enter into the city finally. Of course, by this time, the Jordanians, who have been falling back on every front, have begun to remove themselves. They've begun to actually abandon. There are a few centers of troops left, but they are quickly overwhelmed. The populace, the Arab populace in the city, does a minimal amount of fighting, but they too are unable to stop these determined Israeli troops who have already fought and bled for Jerusalem. The flag goes up over the Kotel, and indeed, a new generation begins to lay claim to Jerusalem as Rabbi Goren blows the first shofar at the wall. Literally, a generation is transformed because Jerusalem now is a Jewish city. That is the transformation that comes. They reclaim the Western Wall. Within 1 week, access to the wall happens because they clear away the buildings that the Jordanians had literally built right next to the wall. Just as Psalm 126 says, when Adonai restored John's fortunes, we thought we were dreaming. This is what Pauline Rose says. We were like dreamers on the first Shabbat. The first Shabbat after the war in June of 1967, my friends, that's almost exactly 53 years ago. Albert and Pauline are accompanied by Uzi-bearing soldiers down to the wall, to the temple. Since the destruction of the temple and the diaspora, this wall had received tears and sorrow and mourning, prayers and pleas for mercies and restoration. The bond of the Jew with Jerusalem and the temple could never be severed, and the world with all its powers could not destroy it. Those are her words, and they ring true. These are words that tell us what would take place then in the hearts of Israel. This is what's transformed even our own time, what we call the Jerusalem effect, as Abby even understood it. Jerusalem, being reclaimed by the Jewish people, has transformed history. Yes, it has transformed it by controversy. It has transformed it by confrontation. Yes, Israel has never been so confrontative of the nations who insisted for so long that they should be second-class citizens. Among the Arabs, they were called dhimmi. The 5th century councils of the Christians declared Jews to be second-class citizens, and so they were treated for 1,000 years in Europe. But the restoration of Jerusalem makes it clear that Israel must rank among the nations. It brings a new pride. It brings a new sense that Israel truly does have a place. And as the Israeli paratrooper Porat, one of the original men who entered the city, beside the wall, declared, "We are writing a new chapter of the Bible." One of the aspects about this that was recovered is, of course, the archaeology of the temple. We begin to understand the temple in a new way. And a brilliant archaeologist, Benjamin Matsar, begins to unravel new mysteries which had been lost, long literally buried under centuries. This is the restoration which will help us to understand the real nature of the functioning Jewish people before the terrible events of 70 AD and the destruction of the city by the Romans. The original Herodian street within the wall is revealed. Today, of course, that street now extends all the way to the city of David. And for the first time, when we return, we will walk from the city of David literally all the way to the temple. It will be possible for us to experience something that wasn't even possible it wasn't even possibly imagined just a generation ago. By the way, what you see here on your screen in the top right corner is the words which are discovered when they do all this archaeology, which brings us right back to the passage we read today, where you read about the blowing of the trumpets. We read and see these incredible advances, including the rabbis' tunnels. And in 1980, as a result of all this, Ben-Gurion's longtime rival, Menachem Begin, as prime minister, brings in what is called the Jerusalem Law, which declares that all of Jerusalem is the undivided and eternal capital of Israel. Of course, even by then, Jewish people begin moving into East Jerusalem. As for this arch, the arch is a memorial arch. You know what it's a memorial of? It's a memorial of the Hurva synagogue. And then it's rebuilt. The arch itself, well, it's secondary because the synagogue itself and the city is transformed. Yeshua was trying to prepare us 2,000 years ago for a spiritual awakening that must happen when the Gentiles are confronted by the restoration of the Jewish people. Both Paul and Yeshua speak of this. They speak of a fullness of the Gentiles, as we read in Romans 11:25. A future moment when Israel will begin to perceive the pierced one. And as Paul also says, the Jewish people begin to come back and discover Messiah. One of the things that we need to realize is this tells us what times we're living in. Not because we know what will happen tomorrow, but because we know the seasons in which God is moving us. For Yeshua, who declared the restoration, was certainly anticipating for us what will come. As he says in Matthew, learn the lesson from the fig tree. As its twigs get tender. Even so, when you see all these things, you know it's near, right at the door. I tell you the truth. And we have these words, this generation, really the words in Greek, agenea ante, or afte, but just as valid is probably not a translation of this generation, but rather this people. This people will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away. Yeshua is preparing us for the season in which we've come. And these circumstances in which it seems as if the world has had to literally step back. These are moments to remember. Do we know what season we're in? My friends, Jerusalem Day is a reminder that Jerusalem is a place of contention. Since the 1920s, the main thrust of Arab instigation against Israel and the Jewish people, which has been laid at Israel's door, has centered on the preservation of this place, the Temple Mount, as an Islamic site to protect it from the Jews. And Israel has suffered terribly from that. Nevertheless, we know that God has his larger purposes, and Israel is preparing for that time when another temple will be built there. I want to bring your attention just back to these words which we read briefly this morning. Shaul arrives in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and what is he told? He's told by the leaders of the Messianic community there these words. You see, brother, how many tens of thousands of believers there are among the Judeans, and they're all zealots for the Torah. This is something which has never really been fully accepted or taught fully in understanding of those who study these scriptures. The word which appears that says tens of thousands is the same word from which we get the word myriads. And the concept of myriads literally is tens of thousands. Jerusalem in that time, well, probably, as I've told you before, may have only been about 50,000 people at the most. But tens of thousands suggest a much larger part of the city, even if it was just more than 10,000. It would tell us that a very significant portion of the city, between 25 to maybe 40% of Jerusalem, was indeed captivated by the message of Yeshua and believers. And of course, as we are today, seeking to be faithful to the Word of God, zealous for the Word of God, zealous for the Torah. We are returning back to a time which Zechariah prepares us for in his vision. It's a vision which precedes the coming of Messiah in his teaching, because it's Zechariah who gives the vision of a nation that looks on one whom they have pierced. But first he writes these words in chapter 2. He speaks about angels talking to him about Jerusalem. And first one appears with a measuring stick. And then another angel appears, and this is the second angel. The angel who was speaking to me was leaving. Another angel came to meet him and said, "Run, tell the man with the young man with the measuring stick, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals, and I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord. I will be its glory within. This is the promise of our coming King." As we close today, we need to seize hold of that vision. Isaiah 61. They shall rebuild the old ruins, raise up the former desolations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the desolations of many generations. We live in that era. The promise is near. How will we take hold? Will we believe in the promise? And will we join together to stay faithful through every season, even as the fig tree blossoms? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you, Lord, that we live in these times. We don't fully comprehend the times we're in, but indeed, you, by your faithfulness, are inspiring us. Take hold of the promise which we have experienced in a small way. Father, I think also of our own hearts. I think of those who have been calling out to me, with whom I've prayed in recent days. There has been a heavy toll, and I myself have felt it. These have been difficult times. It has not been easy to sustain life and work in the environment that we've had for the last 3 months. We've been under pressures. Our families have been under pressures. Our children, we've been tested. We indeed have been tested. We aren't all that happy with how things have worked out. I think some of us have been strained beyond limits than we can bear. And my heart goes out to you. I felt it too. It has been tough to keep the vision, keep the faith in circumstances that are difficult. Heavenly Father, lift our hearts. Lead us closer to you and prepare us, Father, for days of strength, faithfulness, and restoration yet to come. In Yeshua's name, amen.